Whoa. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. This is Jamie from the Flow Genome Project. Welcome back to another one of our Facebook Lives. This is number 3 and stoked to jump in. So you may wonder what the hell is that garish backsplash behind me. I am in downtown Venice Beach on the very corner of Abbot Kinney and hipster heaven in a hotel that looks like it's straight out of Portlandia. I have a retro hand dial rotary phone. There was a vinyl spinning phonograph down in the lobby. Absolutely chapter and verse perfect. If they can only get their air conditioning right, we'll be in business. So I got again going to try and keep this short and sweet, try and keep these little Facebook Lives into about 30 minutes so that anybody who's interested can kind of get what they came for in as little time as possible. And today we are going to follow up on a conversation that we started a couple of installments ago, and has certainly been one that's coming up. I'm actually out here in LA, just gave a talk at Inside Quest. It's a big sort of live video podcast from the folks at Quest Nutrition that do energy bars and all that kind of stuff, and they've had crazy, amazing, interesting people, everybody from Peter Diamandis to Laird Hamilton and Gabi Reese to Sugar Ray Leonard, all kinds of folks. I don't know how I got on there, but was grateful to do so. And in the conversation we had today, this morning, in that studio, that was one of the questions that Tom, the founder of Quest, was sort of bringing up, was, what do we do with this stuff? And what do we do with the information we get from cultivating these peak states or altered states of consciousness? So this is going to be the kind of the unpacking of that story, which is fundamentally if we experience heightened access to information in non-ordinary states of consciousness, and then that can become sort of inspiration, and if we do something with it, it can become integration and transformation. Cool. But where does that supercharged source of information come from? So if you think about it, back in the day, it was always assigned to be something outside of us. We were just mere mortals, fallible humans, and if somebody did get a depth charge of something amazing, it was usually assigned to an outside source, usually sort of supernatural or divine. So that would be the grace, God's grace, or it would be the muses, or whatever personification, or your helper animal, whatever you want to call it. There would be something outside us, and that was what was giving us the turbo boost. In fact, Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, she gave a really interesting TED Talk on that. And the perils of the creative process as a writer or as an artist is that sense of if you think it's you, then when it's not turned on, you can really beat the hell out of yourself. And she sort of reintroduced this notion of think about the muses. But that kind of leaves us in a funny spot, and that leaves this access to information out of our own control and out of our own charge. So what we'd like to do instead is just kind of offer a 3-step process. And this is basically just an extended thought experiment. The first couple are on arguably more solid ground than the last one. And you can basically just kind of choose your own adventure, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go. Okay, so with that, and welcome to everybody else who's just coming on now. We are basically going to take a look at where does the information come from in altered states of consciousness. Okay, so we just talked about the old school, it was a supernatural thing, but it might just be kind of super-natural. It might just be an enhanced state of awareness that we don't normally have access to, and it feels so unusual and so potent that when we get there, it's like, oh my gosh, it couldn't be me. It has to be something beyond myself. But level one is just fundamentally, this is kind of like basically rational materialist neuroscience explanation. So in general, when we're waking, when you guys are watching this, right, we have about 120 bits a second of conscious processing bandwidth. And you are using 60 bits, so about half of it, just to hear me talk. If you were also checking out a computer, if you were also watching something on another screen, you might be close to maxed out on what we can consciously process at any given time. That's why phone numbers are typically 7 digits, all those kind of things. We're actually incredibly small waking conscious memories. Now, when we get into altered states, whether through meditation, mystical states, movement, action sports, psychedelics, whatever it is, smart tech, with electrodes and current or magnetic pulses, any of those things, it doesn't really matter what method we use. Once we get into those states, you have a heightening of norepinephrine. Pay attention, a shot of adrenaline, a heightening of dopamine, which is basically not just a reward chemical, it's a salience signal. And salience just means this is relevant. Salience could mean there's that snarling saber-toothed tiger, or there's that beautiful woman in a bikini, or there's that wonderful double chocolate cream pie. It doesn't really matter which way it goes. It's just pay attention now. And then there's anandamide, which is that endogenous, is that endocannabinoid, right? The ingredients in THC or cannabis, and that increases sense of well-being, but also lateral thinking. So if you just take the fact that our prefrontal cortex, which is that's our normal inner monologue, goes quiet, so we're perceiving more. We're not discarding so much at the door. Like our gatekeeper, our bouncer, is not at the front of the club anymore. So more information is just coming in. The neurochemicals are making us pay more attention, see more connections, and make more lateral leaps, right? And our focus is driven into the now, which means rather than half daydreaming about what did happen, half fantasizing about what's gonna happen, all of my attention, even of that 120 bits, is actually here. That alone gives us enough of a bump up, right? Enough of a shift in perspective to go from 120 bits a second to, and again, this is not actual, but just as a comparison, our retinas, right, just what's happening in our eyes, processing up to 11 million bits a second. So you go from 120 to 11 million. That's not to say we go all the way to 11 million with our processing, but it is to say there is a lot of information that we don't normally focus on and pay attention to, that in an altered state, because of the neurochemistry and because of what's happening in our brains and because of what's happening in our focus, can actually kick us into a massively accelerated state. Cool? So that's level one. That's kind of like the reductionist, materialist argument, and you don't really need to go beyond that. That's the one that we would advance when we're in big corporations and we're talking about this stuff, and you don't know kind of your audience, how far down the rabbit hole they're interested or willing to go, and you can just kind of say, hey, even if you just accept that, you're going from hundreds of things to millions of things, and we get to pay more attention along the way. That used to feel supernatural. Now it's just a super -natural move. Awesome. Okay. The next level would be, is there something else about that information other than just paying more attention, right? Paying more attention to the bit stream. And to take this next step, you kind of need to know sort of a couple of thought experiments, which is, do we have more information inside us? Is there a certain sense of intrinsic knowing or knowledge that in an altered state of consciousness we have better or clearer access to than we normally do? And I think it's at least worth considering, because certainly one of the most consistent subjective feelings, how does it actually feel to be in an altered state, tends to have it. There's this phrase that the Greeks had, which was anamnesis, right? Which is fundamentally, it's the opposite of amnesia, and it means the forgetting of the forgetting, or a sense of deep remembering. And one of the things that people consistently report, all the way back from William James at Harvard back in the 19th century, is this almost sense of deja vu. Like, oh, when you get to that level of information in an altered state, there's that sense of the moment you glimpse it, you're like, oh yeah, I remember this. I remember this. So the question is, why? Well, why do we have that weird feeling of deep familiarity and almost picking right back up where we left off, almost like we're sort of narcoleptic in our own sort of development or inner conversation? So one thing you could say is, take a couple of these studies. Right? There's been some really fascinating studies on epigenetics in the last few years, and I'll share with you a couple of them. One was on rats. Always giant caveat, not everything that happens for rats also happens to people, but one of the things that they did that was really interesting was basically do a little Pavlovian conditioning, so a sort of a shock, like aversive condition is this sort of fancy term for it, but basically you zap a rat with a shock, like ring a bell, zap a rat, see what happens, ring a bell, zap a rat, and then have 2 more generations of those rats. So now you've got the poor traumatized rat's grandkid, and you ring the bell and they flinch, even though there's no shock. And so they relatively convincingly were demonstrating that trauma can be passed down epigenetically, which means here's my genes, my DNA, and then epigenetic is just how are they expressed based on environmental conditions. So because of a traumatic experience 2 generations upstream, that then baby rat was also traumatized. And some folks have also done comparable studies with post-Holocaust Jewish families, and have been advancing a similar notion, which is that if a family, or basically a nuclear family or a biological family, has gone through intense trauma, that it can kick downstream and still effectively live in the brains, bodies, and genetic expression of descendants. And just to pull that out of rat land and say, okay, now another interesting one was a study of Scandinavian, like northern Scandinavian villages who had really strangely robustly healthful males in the sort of 45 to 55 range, and they didn't know why. And they were checking, is it like Okinawan diet kind of stuff? Is it what are they doing up there that they're living so well? And they finally traced it all back to grandfathers who had experienced periods of famine from a very specific time, from age 12 to 15. So essentially when their grandfathers were hitting puberty, i.e., creating and formulating all of their sperm and genetic material they were ready to pass on. If they were hungry during a winter for up to like about a 3-month kind of period, then paradoxically, the opposite of the rats, where the rats' trauma was actually kicked down the road and passed on, instead, famine, if grandpa went hungry as a skinny little kid, the grandsons were super robust with cardiovascular health and actually lived to ripe old ages. So even if you just take those two examples, you're like, okay, this is fascinating. The experience of a singular human individual can pass on an actual lived experience, either psychological, if we grant the rats the luxury of mind, of a concept of mind, or physiological in the case of the Scandinavian study. So now you're like, okay, so this is interesting. Individual experiences can be passed on through multiple generations, and they can show up in our bodies and our minds. So then you think, okay, what about all my ancestors? What about the entire evolutionary history of our species or race or whatever bucket you want to kind of just smaller or larger lens you want to lay over this? Wouldn't it also be plausible? In fact, you almost think it would have to be that we also do have some encoded ancestral knowledge or information if a single grandpa going hungry for 3 months can show up in a measurable way. So then you think, okay, so that could be another set of information that's in us that we have access to in an altered state, in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, so not my waking rational self, but just in sort of a sensing, thinking, perceiving way. Am I able to tap into that in a more interesting manner? And then if you want to take that, so you can timestamp that and you say, okay, I'm willing to consider that. That might be, in addition to just perceiving more of what's around me, the kind of bits, bit processing of hundreds to millions, you can then say, okay, now is there something in my epigenetic expression, in my genetic code? So click on that another level. So we've just talked about people in my bloodline, effectively. Very straightforward and very kind of concrete how the information would have got to me. Okay, now you can take another thing and say, okay, what is in our DNA? We are all organic carbon-based life forms, and DNA is nothing but a binary information strand. Right? In fact, I think I read last month that they are now able to store something like 1 million copies of a movie on a single strand of DNA, something absurd that I really can't wrap my head around still. But the idea is not only does DNA do what it's always done, but that now we're learning to tinker with it and engineer it, so that we can actually encode additional information in the forms of binary information, zeros and ones, that in this case could show up as movies, sound and video, but that clearly the DNA strands are all there as well. And the question is okay, we're carbon-based life forms. Where did all of our minerals, right? Where did this all come from? It all came from, like, the Earth was just a rock until it got bombarded with asteroids, right, and other space junk slamming into us and bringing the minerals, the elements, right, and arguably the spark of life. Francis Crick, right, the half of the Nobel Prize winning team, Watson and Crick, who came up with the DNA the double helix in the first place, right, had his notion of the panspermia hypothesis, the idea that somewhere out of here came life to this planet. And that doesn't mean some grand mythological narrative. That just means this was just a rock of, just a ball of dust, rock and ice, until star stuff slammed into it. So you're like, okay, and we are made of that stuff. So if we can experience epigenetically, right, the DNA expression, the genetic expression of grandpa, and maybe my great-great-great-great-grandpa, and maybe all my great-great-grandpas and grandmas and everybody else, and that same DNA is just binary encoded information strands that originated, right, in the Big Bang, fundamentally, if you chase it that far back, then you're like, oh my God, we have the entire history of the universe encoded in our actual cellular matter. And that's really like material. There's nothing metaphysical about it at all. And the only question is do we have the skeleton key of unlocking that information, right? So that's the kind of far end of the level 2 hypothesis. Level 1 was just we're paying more attention to what's going on around us, meaningfully more, exponentially more. Level 2 is we're actually almost able to look within ourselves, and encoded within ourselves, right, is, depending on which level of the thought experiment you're willing to engage, right, is a pile more, ultimately, potentially, infinitely more information. And then the third one, funnily enough, is not one I've even entertained. Like, I'm more than happy just trying to wrap my head around level 2. But there are people, David Eagleman, from one of the most famous and accomplished neuroscientists, is also a friend and advisory board member to the Flow Genome Project, is his idea is that the idea of what's the relationship between brain and mind is it possible that our brains and our bodies are fundamentally like the radio set, the receiver, and what gets played through that speaker is fundamentally signal from someplace else. And so that's a highly credible neuroscientist advancing that case. Once you get into that territory where you say, hey, we are instruments, and we are receiving, perceiving, decoding, whatever verb you want to give it, information that exists above and beyond us. Then you've almost kind of come back full circle to a potentially metaphysical explanation, in the sense that, right, Plato originally said it was the realm of ideal forms. Like up there was this perfect chair, there was this perfect apple, there was this perfect everything, and we just occasionally tap into it, and we can perceive it. Teilhard de Chardin called it the noosphere, right? This realm, not just the ecosphere, right, but this realm of mind that was sort of shared. More recently and controversially, Rupert Sheldrake, named it sort of the idea of morphogenetic fields. The idea of almost like literally like different animals tuning into the radio stations or different radio stations. So it's almost interesting, I think, that David Eagleman has kind of come back around to at least posit something in that neck of the woods, but from a really research-based scientific perspective. So without having to kind of go off the deep end in any particular direction, we can begin to wonder, hey, that sense of anamnesis, that sense of forgetting our forgetting, of remembering what we've always known, and it feeling like deja vu, it feeling super familiar and absolutely our own knowledge, right? Then the question is like, well, where is it all coming from? So hopefully these three categories kind of give us permission to think a little bit more clearly about it. We don't have to just jump into quasi-mystical explanations. You're welcome to if you want to. Our interest, our preference at Flow Genome Project is always to kind of stay content neutral, which is let's give people mechanisms for thinking about this stuff for themselves and then have them go conduct their own experiments, rather than saying this is the way things are, right? Because it's highly unlikely. The moment we try and stop the slot machine of the universe from spinning all its possibilities and say that and that alone, we're almost certainly going to be false in some shape or form. So we'd rather say, hey, here's some things to check out. So my question is what do you guys think? And which of those explanations, the kind of level 1, reduction materialist, we're just paying more attention to real data around us. Level 2, we're gaining access to some form of information encoded in us, epigenetically, genetically, at the level of DNA, and potentially all the way down to the level of the fundamental elements of of this planet and the universe we live in, this solar system. Or level 3, we're more instruments, and we're actually tuning into an information layer that is kind of above and beyond us and distinct from us, but just sometimes we get to tune into it. So Mo, you've got one. You said this is gnosis, what I would like to call DNA gnosis. Self-knowledge through introspection leads to self-enfoldment. Interesting, self-enfoldment through extrospection, looking outwards. Okay, nicely said. Yeah. So. Just so everybody else understands the language there, gnosis is typically described as the experience of deep, true knowing. And so the idea of DNA gnosis could be, in fact, the information's inside us, and when we unlock it, particularly from getting out of our normal waking states, that we can have access to it. So that's a great one. Maria is just asking, what happens when you tap into the realm of mind? Well, I mean, I think this is the beautiful thing. right, is what happens when any of us tap into the realm of our minds, is what is happening in the realm of our minds. And it's unique and different. And I think as much as I'd love to start saying, hey, provisionally this is what seems to happen in most instances, etc., I think we just need more people conducting this experiment. And when I say this experiment, what I'm meaning is finding skillful means to access peak states relatively often, taking level-headed notes, not jumping to premature interpretations and explanations, and continuing to kind of cautiously, skeptically, but with open hearts and minds, map the terrain we're all finding. And when we do that, because I mean, there are crazy things that do seem to happen. You know, extreme athletes will say, you know, in fact, I mean, Dean Potter, who was on our advisory board, he died this time last year, base jumping, but he was describing a situation where he was climbing, and he just went down in Patagonia, and he just went for this sort of 2-day, 3-day sort of out of his mind flow state solo, where he linked a bunch of crazy peaks, and he was basically saying, yeah, and he wasn't with ropes, he was by himself, so no protection, you fall, you die, and he found ways up those mountains, like crazy little ledge holds and it sort of just all unlocked for him. And it was this incredibly powerful experience for him. It wasn't just blind luck. It was as if he was being guided. There are surfers who have said, I've dropped into a wave where this one could have killed me, and I suddenly found, in fact, Laird Hamilton in Jaws, you know, where he was suddenly getting sucked up the wall of the wave and was just about to get absolutely slammed and possibly drowned, and he just did a hop. He basically just jumped out the wall of the wave and landed 10 feet lower, you know, in a move that he'd never done, that Dave Kalama, his water buddy, had never seen before, and just pulled it off in the moment. It happens with musicians who are incredibly jamming, and then suddenly the next thing they know, they're not playing the solo they practiced for this part. They're suddenly off almost ahead of their own inner ear, playing notes they didn't even know they had in them. And that is, obviously, that's the crack cocaine of musicians and jamming, right? That's why people are like, sorry, Mom, I know I was going to be a banker, but I'm going to be a rock and roll star, you know? Because when those moments come through, they are utterly ineffable. Owen, awesome to see you, and I guess I must have invoked you in there with that Dean story, man. It's good to see your name on there, Chief. So the question is once again, where does it come from? How do we find more of it? And what do we do with it once we do? Because my sense is that, and I'll float this really softly. This one's a take it or leave it. This is just my own experience, and what it seems like to me is that for whatever reason, and I don't presume to know why, that information often seems to have a direction to it. It often seems to have an injunction to it, in the sense of you don't just get to take the joyride for fun. That there is, you know, sort of, it's like if you get to ride the Ferris wheel, then you kind of got to scrub the tracks a little bit too. There's a sense of now go do your homework. And, you know, I was talking with Jason Silva last week, and we were just kind of riffing on this, but there sort of a fairly neat little equation came up, which is ecstasis, right? Those moments of stepping beyond ourselves, plus catharsis, the actual mending of what's broken, equals gnosis, equals that ineffable sense of, yes, I'm tapped into that information field. I am both seeing more and fixing more. And if I go back and forth between the high peak experience and the work it shows me is still to be done in the valley, then I end up with gnosis or apotheosis or whatever you'd like to call it. And so to that's as far as I'm comfortable going out on the limb of making meaning for other people. But what we would just say is just go conduct the experiment. Go see. And interestingly enough, that's how like first century Christianity was. Like back when it was just a handful of folks gathered around the teachings of the Nazarene and the apostles. They were like, okay, we know who we are because everybody's on fire, literally. Like they're, you know, by their fruits ye shall know them. And women were able to be priests. There was, you know, art, music, all kinds. It was a wild-ass underground scene. I mean, it was far closer to like the Burning Man culture today than stuffy lockdown Orthodox churches by the Middle Ages, right? And and there was actually a battle. If anybody's interested in this, it was a National Book Award or Pulitzer Prize winning book award called The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels at Princeton. So it was in the mid-70s the book came out, but it was the translation of the Nag Hammadi scrolls, which had come out of Egypt and Oxford University in the 50s. And it's fascinating because you realize, oh wow, so that's an early Gnostic tradition, and it really just came down to a tug of war between the bureaucrats and the ecstatics. And the bureaucrats won because the ecstatics said, look, the only people that are truly Christians, like, they have a light in their eyes. We know them. Like the brothers and sisters, we can tell. We can tell how they sing, how they dance, how they move, how they pray, right? We can tell. And then Paul and the bureaucrats were like, hey, no, let everybody in and pass the collection plate. So let's grow an organization, and let's do it with revenue and numbers. And that was the fork in the road. So we could have had a radically different history of Western Europe and everything else had only the ecstatics prevailed. But this is the same conundrum that prompted us to form Flow Genome Project in the first place, which is the people who are really good at having ecstatic experiences have very little interest in studying them generally, and the people that are interested in studying them are rarely any good at having them. So you end up with this split by the people who are documenting it. Usually, I mean, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, God bless him, right, was, the godfather of flow, was renowned for being one of the dullest lecturers on the planet. And you think, now, how is that? And then who are the best flow heads? They're these, 12-year-old little surfer grommets hanging out in Hawaii. So those are always the paradoxes of seeking these states. And I think what is hopefully different and what's really exciting about today, like right now, is that it's no longer a kind of a bohemian or hippie tune-in, turn-on, drop-out, or a surf bum, ski bum kind of thing. We've got more and more people who are fiercely committed to their work in the world, but who are also skillfully accessing peak states and using that information really deliberately to bring it back, put it on the ground in practical applications. Tim Ferriss, right, just told us in his interview for our book, he's like, virtually all the billionaires in Silicon Valley I know use psychedelics on a regular basis to solve global problems. And if you think about what Elon Musk is doing, Elon Musk is talking about bringing 1 million people to Mars. He's 50 to 100 years ahead of his own businesses. It is highly likely that the entire Tesla car thing that he's doing, which is, just by the way, disrupting the entire auto industry, which is a century old and hyper resistant to change, could just be a pawn move on the chessboard as a proof of concept for him actually disrupting the entire energy grid. And you're like, holy shit, this dude is playing a long ass game. Whether I agree with all of his moves, whether I believe he's going to pull it off, all of that is sort of almost irrelevant to the point of like, how big a game can we play these days? And that's the part that is sort of most fascinating. And so I'll leave you guys with one last thing, which is, in fact, let's just see, Maria, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Have you ever heard of the Theosophical Society? Yes. Theosophical folks, for anybody that doesn't know, Madame Blavatsky, Krishnamurti was their protege. They groomed him, and then Krishnamurti kind of bounced from the whole organization. Funnily enough, we will be teaching in London, the Tyringham Institute this spring, which was the home of the Theosophists in the late 19th century. So we'll be coming full circle to that community as well. Let's just check anybody else. Vicky was just saying, my test has been to train my mind to listen to my body. Absolutely. And vice versa. Right, train our bodies so that we can hear and pay attention to our minds even more. A calm and settled, integrated body is an awesome supportive tool. Whoa! I'm just losing my little mini tripod. Let's just see. I'll just take a time to answer a couple more questions, and then I'll just leave you guys with one more thought. Let's just see. Yeah, so Vicky was just saying, hey, is some of that old information potentially kind of past life traumas? Hard saying not knowing. That gets into meaning making, and I'm going to steer clear of that. You're welcome to make whatever you'd like out of that, but certainly the notion of epigenetic expression demystifies it. You don't even have to buy into a concept of reincarnation or anything that's sort of an article of faith to just say, yeah, man, it's in our genetic coding, and there's now really clear empirical evidence to suggest that stuff does get passed down. So I will leave you guys with one final thought, which is just this idea of the cultural assumptions that sort of support or prevent us from tuning into more of this information more often. And anthropologists basically lump societies into two different buckets. as far as how they perceive the information layer. One is a monophasic society, literally mono meaning one, phase meaning basically the channel they tune into. So a single channel society, and you can make a case that us and the Western rational materialist West are a monophasic society. In the past, most indigenous traditions were polyphasic. They actually grooved on a lot of different channels. So whether it was trance or possession or dreams or visions or omens, right? There was all these other things that could happen in their world. And that information that came from those things, they took dead seriously. They took as valid or even as more valid than waking state perception and apprehension. So when you have Nietzsche saying God is dead, right, he was basically speaking to a realm of like the triumph of the ego and the intellect over superstition and mysticism. Well, and we rightly said there's a lot of superstition and mysticism in that stuff. There's a lot of just hocus pocus. But we also killed our access to multiple channels. So where we stand today is on the verge of being able to come up to not an irrational polyphasic society, meaning we're just magical thinking and superstitious, but we're listening to everything, into instead a post-rational polyphasic society, meaning we still keep our wits about us, that's still the rational part, but we're also going beyond that single channel of rational information perception into a multi-channel realm and culture. So I'll leave you guys with that. The notion there would be, what is it like to start cultivating for ourselves, then each other, and then broader and broader groups, a post-rational, polyphasic culture that lets us access and act on the information, the inspiration, and if we're really doing our homework, the transformation that results from more data from more places. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you all so much. Really enjoying getting to think through this stuff out loud with you guys, getting to hear your comments and thoughts, and wish you all the best. If anybody's interested, feel free to jump on our website, flowgenomeproject.com. There is a free flow profile, lets you know how do you personally get into flow states or peak states more often. It has kind of tips and tricks, cautions, all that kind of stuff. And it's the largest optimal psychology project going right now. We've got over 40,000 people who have taken it, and we're going to be sharing the results with educators, healthcare providers, all that kind of good stuff. So again, thanks for all the thoughts, lots of love, and see you guys again next week. Cheers, everybody.